Henry VIII is famous for having 6 wives. Traditionally, the queen consorts of England were buried beside or close to their husbands. However, with 2 wives executed, 2 divorced, 1 dying in childbirth, and only 1 surviving him, it is little surprise that Henry is not buried next to them all. So where are Henry's wives buried? Which queens were honoured, which were diminished, and which endured unrest long after death? Katherine of Aragon was married to Henry for nearly 20 years. She never accepted his claim that their marriage had been lawfully ended, and steadfastly regarded herself as the true and rightful Queen of England until her death. Her refusal to acknowledge the divorce deeply angered Henry. As punishment, he banished her from court and cruelly denied her access to their daughter, Mary I. Katherine was sent to Kimbolton Castle, a grim and decaying medieval fortress wholly unfit for a former queen, cold, damp and isolated. It took a severe toll on her health, which declined rapidly in her final years. She knew that her life was drawing to a close, and in one of her final acts she wrote a last letter to Henry, still clinging to her belief that she was queen. Upon hearing news of her death, Henry and his new queen, Anne Boleyn, celebrated by dressing in yellow. The question of Katherine's burial then arose. She remained immensely popular among the English people, many of whom, like Katherine herself, continued to regard her as the true and rightful queen. Henry ultimately decided that she should be buried at Peterborough Abbey, now Peterborough Cathedral. It was a building of sufficient grandeur, yet far enough from London to avoid drawing excessive attention or public unrest. When Katherine was laid to rest, she was denied the full honours traditionally accorded to a Queen of England. Instead, she was buried under the diminished title of Dowager Princess of Wales, a final symbolic slight that underscored Henry's determination to erase her status, even in death. The so-called divorce was in legal terms, an annulment. This declaration asserted that Katherine's marriage to Henry VIII had never been valid, and therefore had never truly existed. As a result, Katherine was officially treated not as Henry's former wife, but as the widow of his elder brother, Arthur, Prince of Wales. This legal fiction shaped how she was regarded even after death. However, in later years, the markings on her grave were amended to acknowledge what many had always believed, that Katherine was in truth a Queen of England. Katherine of Aragon died on the 7th of January 1536 at Kimbolton Castle. She was buried on the 29th of January 1536 at Peterborough Cathedral, where her grave can still be visited today, a lasting testament to a queen whose dignity and conviction endured long after her fall from power. Anne Boleyn was famously executed on Tower Green on the 19th of May 1536. Having been convicted on fabricated charges of adultery and treason, her fall was as swift as it was brutal. Before her execution, Anne was stripped of her title as Queen of England, and her marriage to Henry VIII was annulled. In legal terms, this meant she held no royal status at the time of her death. In a final indignity, no coffin had been prepared for her burial. Instead, her body was placed in an empty arrow chest and carried a short distance to the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, where she was laid to rest. The modest burial, so close to the site of her execution, starkly contrasted with the power and splendour she had once enjoyed as queen. The Chapel Royal of St. Peter ad Vincula serves as the parish church of the Tower of London. It is the final resting place of many notable figures from Tudor history, almost all of whom were executed after being imprisoned within the tower's walls. Anne Boleyn was buried within the chapel, believed to be somewhere near the altar. However, precise records of her burial location were never kept. During the Victorian era, when excavations were undertaken to carry out structural repairs, several bodies were discovered in front of the altar. Owing to the lack of clear documentation, it proved impossible to identify with certainty which remains belonged to which individual. As a result, historians continue to debate the exact position of Anne Boleyn's remains within the chapel, a mystery that endures nearly 5 centuries after her death. Anne Boleyn died on the 19th of May 1536 at the Tower of London, and was buried later that same day in the Chapel Royal of St. Peter ad Vincula, within the Tower precincts. Jane Seymour succeeded where Henry's previous 2 wives had failed. She provided the king with a legitimate male heir. On the 12th of October 1537, she gave birth to Prince Edward VI at Hampton Court Palace. Despite a long and difficult labour, the initial signs were encouraging. Jane appeared to be recovering well, and in the days following the birth, was well enough to sign letters and official documents. However, her recovery was tragically short-lived. Only a few days after Edward's birth, Jane fell seriously ill. She's widely believed to have contracted puerperal fever, then known as childbed fever, a common and often fatal infection following childbirth. Jane Seymour died on the 24th of October 1537 at Hampton Court Palace. Just 12 days after fulfilling Henry's greatest dynastic ambition, Jane was buried on the 12th of November 1537 in a vault in the choir of St. George's Chapel. The funeral was conducted with full royal honours, and Henry's daughter Mary I acted as chief mourner. Jane Seymour was the only one of Henry's 6 wives to receive a queen's funeral, a clear reflection of the value Henry placed on her role as the mother of his long-awaited son. In 1547, Henry VIII was to join her in the vault after his own death. Out of all 6 of his wives, Henry VIII chose to be buried next to Jane Seymour. This was a dynastic decision, as Jane had been the sole wife to provide him with a legitimate male heir. Jane Seymour died on the 24th of October 1537 at Hampton Court Palace, and was buried on 12th of November 1537 at St George's Chapel, Windsor Castle. Anne of Cleves was married to Henry for the shortest time of any of his 6 wives. Their marriage lasted just over 6 months and ended in another divorce, technically an annulment. Unlike Henry's bitter split from Katherine of Aragon, this separation was notably amicable. Anne agreed to the annulment and in return received a generous financial settlement and several properties. As a result, she enjoyed a comfortable and independent life in England, leading many historians to argue that she ultimately secured the best outcome of all Henry's wives. She went on to outlive every one of them and even lived to witness the coronation of Henry's daughter, Mary I. Anne maintained good relations with Mary, often known as Bloody Mary, and converted to Catholicism to please the new queen. This loyalty was rewarded when Anne died at Chelsea Manor on the 16th of July 1557, probably from cancer. Mary personally arranged for her burial in Westminster Abbey, an exceptional honour. Anne of Cleves is the only one of Henry VIII's wives to be buried there, among monarchs, statesmen, and some of the most celebrated figures in English history. Despite this prestigious location, Anne's tomb is surprisingly modest. Often described as somewhat hard to find, it lies on the south side of the high altar. The stone tomb is carved with her initials, crowns, and heraldic lions, simple yet dignified, much like Anne herself. Anne of Cleves died on the 16th of July 1557 at Chelsea Manor and was buried on the 3rd of August 1557 at Westminster Abbey. Katherine Howard was beheaded on the 13th of February 1542 at Tower Green. A bill of attainder had been passed against her, accusing her of failing to disclose her premarital sexual history to the king within 20 days of their marriage, and of encouraging another man to commit adultery with her. Under Tudor law, these offences were construed as treason. Legend surrounds Katherine's final hours. It is said that on the night before her execution, she asked for the execution block to be brought to her chambers so that she might practice laying her head upon it. On the morning itself, she was reportedly so terrified that she required assistance to climb the few short steps to the scaffold. Like Anne Boleyn before her, Katherine was buried within the Chapel Royal of St Peter ad Vincula, believed to be somewhere near the altar. During Victorian-era renovations to the chapel, several bodies were uncovered, but Katherine's remains could not be conclusively identified. Some have suggested that she was so young at the time of her death, possibly still a teenager, that her bones had not fully hardened and had decomposed entirely. Others claim that lime may have been added to her grave to hasten decay. There is also ongoing debate among historians as to whether remains sometimes attributed to Anne Boleyn may, in fact, belong to Katherine Howard. With incomplete records and centuries of disturbance, the truth is likely lost forever. Katherine Howard died on the 13th of February 1542 at the Tower of London, and was buried later that same day in the Chapel Royal of St Peter ad Vincula within the Tower precincts. Katherine Parr is remembered as Henry's final wife and the one who famously survived him, yet her survival was tragically brief. Only 4 months after Henry's death, Katherine caused considerable scandal by secretly marrying Thomas Seymour, the brother of Jane Seymour. The marriage was conducted in secrecy, as Katherine knew the Privy Council would never sanction such a union so soon after the king's death. Katherine soon became pregnant. Despite having been married 4 times, this was her first pregnancy, and at 35 years old she was considered very late in life for a first childbirth in the Tudor era. In June 1548, she and Thomas Seymour moved to his country estate, Sudeley Castle. In late August 1548, Katherine gave birth to a daughter, Mary. Initially, all seemed well, but tragedy soon followed. Like Jane Seymour before her, Katherine contracted puerperal fever, commonly known as childbed fever, and died on the 5th of September 1548. Her funeral took place 2 days later, with Lady Jane Grey acting as chief mourner. Katherine Parr was buried on the 7th of September 1548 at Sudeley Castle, making her the only one of Henry's wives not interred in London or Windsor. However, her rest was far from peaceful. During the English Civil War, Sudeley Castle was sacked, and Katherine's tomb was desecrated. Soldiers reportedly broke open her grave and found her body remarkably well preserved, a discovery that provoked both awe and further violation. Repeated disturbances over the centuries have made Katherine Parr's final resting place one of the most unsettled of all Henry VIII's queens. A poignant and ironic end for the wife who survived the king, only to meet a fate as tragic as the others, Over the centuries, the remains of Katherine Parr were disturbed on multiple occasions. By the 18th century, visitors to the chapel at Sudeley Castle recorded the shocking sight of her coffin lying exposed. Some accounts even claim that curious onlookers were offered macabre souvenirs, snippets of her shroud or locks of her hair, reflecting a disturbing blend of fascination and disrespect for the dead. It was not until the 19th century that serious efforts were made to restore dignity to Katherine's final resting place. Her remains were carefully reinterred in a new coffin, and the chapel in which she lay was repaired and restored, finally granting her a measure of the peace that had long been denied. Today, visitors to Sudeley Castle can pay their respects to this resilient and intellectually formidable queen. Katherine Parr's tomb stands as a poignant reminder of the turbulence of the Tudor era, the often blurred boundaries between reverence and curiosity, and the enduring legacy of a dynasty that continues to captivate us. Her story, both in life and after death, underscores humanity's desire to keep history alive, sometimes quite literally, and the responsibility to honour those who have gone before us.